It was a move that aimed to showcase economic strength and political determination. In a major announcement, then-President Donald Trump imposed a 25% tariff on all goods imported from Mexico. The reasoning behind the decision was threefold: to protect American jobs, to push back against what the administration called unchecked illegal immigration, and to apply pressure on Mexico to take stronger action on its own southern border. On the surface, it looked like a bold play in an ongoing trade battle. But the response and the consequences were immediate. Within hours of the tariffs being confirmed, financial markets reacted with sharp volatility. Major indexes dropped, with investors expressing concern over what this might mean for the closely linked economies of the US and Mexico. Many sectors were affected, but none more so than the automotive industry. For decades, the auto sector in the United States has relied heavily on a system known as just-in-time manufacturing. It's a lean production strategy where parts are shipped and delivered only as they're needed, rather than stockpiled in advance. While this method helps companies cut costs and improve efficiency, it also creates significant risks. Disruptions, even small ones, can bring entire assembly lines to a standstill, and that's exactly what began to unfold. In response to Trump's move, the Mexican government quickly announced a halt on the export of specific auto parts that are essential to U.S. vehicle production. The decision wasn't random, it was carefully targeted. Rather than launching a broad economic retaliation, Mexico focused its response on one of the most vulnerable points in the U.S. economy: auto manufacturing. Factories across the Midwest began feeling the impact almost immediately. From Michigan and Indiana to Ohio and Kentucky, reports came in of stalled production lines and delayed deliveries. Major automakers such as Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis raised early alarms indicating that shipments had either slowed down significantly or stopped altogether. These parts weren't optional or secondary. They were critical components such as wiring harnesses, electronic control modules, and small engine parts. Without them, the production process couldn't continue. One of the challenges automakers faced was the tight buffer they operate under. Many plants carry just a few days' worth of inventory. Once those limited supplies were used, there were no alternatives. The system, by design, lacked flexibility. So when the flow of parts from Mexico stopped, the ripple effect was felt almost immediately. Workers were sent home, shifts were canceled, production timelines were thrown off course. Although the Mexican government said its decision was temporary and conditional, suggesting it could be reversed if the U.S. rolled back tariffs, the message was clear. Mexico was willing and able to respond with economic pressure of its own. Industry experts began warning that even a brief disruption could have lasting effects. With so many factories already working to recover from supply chain issues that began during the pandemic, this latest development pushed things closer to crisis. Behind the scenes, automakers scrambled. Emergency meetings were called. Contingency plans were dusted off, though few offered any quick fixes. Executives began reaching out to Washington, urging the administration to reconsider its approach before things escalated further. At the same time, Wall Street responded with growing concern. The Dow Jones fell sharply in early trading following the announcement. Shares in automakers, as well as key suppliers, dropped. Companies like BorgWarner, Aptiv, and Magna International, all of which produce major vehicle systems and components, saw their stock prices fall. Analysts noted that the market wasn't only reacting to the tariffs themselves, but also to the broader uncertainty they represented. The trade war was no longer just an abstract policy debate. It was beginning to affect production, jobs, and consumer confidence. While financial markets reeled, the reaction in industrial towns across the Midwest was more visceral. These were communities that had experienced years of economic struggle and had pinned hopes on policies promising job growth and industrial revitalization. Many of them had supported Trump, in part because of his message about bringing manufacturing back to American soil. Now, with factories shutting down due to a lack of parts, those promises were under scrutiny. Layoffs began to hit within 48 hours of the Mexican export freeze. In Flint, Michigan, hundreds of workers at a General Motors facility were sent home. In Louisville, Kentucky, Ford employees were warned of possible indefinite shutdowns. And in places like Lordstown, Ohio, a town that had been spotlighted in campaign speeches about reviving American manufacturing, Workers gathered outside factory gates that had fallen silent once again. The mood had shifted from hope to frustration. Union leaders who had previously been cautiously optimistic about the administration's approach started to push back more openly. The AFL-CIO, America's largest federation of labor unions, released a strong statement criticizing the tariffs as a short-sighted move with devastating consequences for the very workers they were meant to protect. Local union chapters organized emergency meetings, which in some cases turned into heated exchanges between constituents and their elected representatives. The situation highlighted a deeper tension in U.S. trade policy, balancing national interests with the realities of a global economy. While there was broad agreement that the U.S. needed to rethink its approach to international trade, many questioned whether unilateral tariffs were the best tool. They were seen by some as a blunt instrument, capable of creating disruption, but not necessarily achieving long-term change. For the auto industry, the numbers painted a stark picture. Mexico supplies more than 87% of the wiring harnesses used in vehicles assembled in the U.S. Over 60% of small engine components and around 70% of the electronic modules used in electric and hybrid vehicles also come from Mexican factories. Cutting off that flow of goods wasn't just an inconvenience, it amounted to a functional shutdown of U.S. car production. The White House downplayed the severity at first. Officials argued that Mexico had more to lose from a prolonged economic fight and predicted that production would resume soon. But within the business community, that optimism was not widely shared. Industry leaders pointed out that supply chain disruptions are difficult to reverse. Even if the standoff ended quickly, restarting paused assembly lines could take weeks, if not longer. The decision by John Deere to move a portion of its manufacturing operations to Mexico gave the country a major economic and symbolic win. This was not just any company. It was one of the most iconic American brands, long associated with rural values, farming tradition, and domestic production. When John Deere announced it would transfer cab assembly operations and other equipment production to facilities in Ramos, Mexico, the move was initially presented as a cost-saving measure. The company claimed it needed to adapt to a more competitive and uncertain market, but the timing made the consequences even more significant. For Mexico, it was an unexpected boost. Officials there were quick to highlight the country's skilled workforce, strong manufacturing infrastructure, and growing role in global supply chains. John Deere's shift was framed as a vote of confidence in Mexico's long-term value to international businesses. Behind closed doors, Mexican trade officials used the news to strengthen their position in negotiations with the United States. It was a clear message. Despite tariffs, American companies still saw Mexico as essential to their operations. This narrative began to gain traction well beyond North America. Across Latin America, Europe, and parts of Asia, Mexico started being seen not just as a manufacturing partner, but as a more stable alternative to the increasingly unpredictable U.S. regulatory environment. With its combination of low labor costs, favorable trade agreements, and a central role in supply chains, Mexico's profile was on the rise. And it wasn't just about cars and tractors. Electronics firms, machinery manufacturers, and suppliers in other sectors began expressing interest in either expanding or relocating operations to Mexico. The pressure that had originally been aimed at Mexico to bend to U.S. policy was now working in reverse. American companies were bending to economic reality, and in doing so, giving Mexico greater power at the negotiating table. While this dynamic was playing out between the U.S. and Mexico, another major global player was moving in the background: China. Unlike the bold responses seen from North America, China didn't escalate tensions or engage in public retaliation. Instead, it quietly accelerated a strategy that had been in motion for more than a decade, reducing its dependence on American agriculture. For years, U.S. farmers were told that China would be their biggest export market. The assumption was simple. As China's population grew and urbanization increased, so too would its demand for agricultural imports. American corn, soybeans, wheat, and meat were expected to feed that demand. Infrastructure was built. Farmland was expanded. Equipment was purchased based on this long-term outlook. But reality shifted. Rather than increasing imports from the United States, China started investing heavily in its own agricultural capabilities. With massive government support, The country ramped up production, introduced new high-yield crop varieties, and expanded the use of mechanized equipment. Entire regions were redesigned with large-scale irrigation systems and high-efficiency farms. Even more strategically, China focused on reducing its reliance on foreign-made agricultural machinery. Domestic firms like YTO Group and Zoomlion received state backing to scale production. While these Chinese machines lacked the brand prestige of American products, they were affordable, functional, and increasingly reliable. In markets across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, these machines found new buyers. For developing countries looking to modernize their farming sectors, lower-cost Chinese equipment became an attractive alternative. The result was a slow but steady decline in American agricultural exports to China. The promised market of the future was no longer there. What replaced it was a self-sufficient and increasingly competitive China, no longer dependent on the U.S. for food security. The U.S. agricultural sector, still recovering from pandemic-era disruptions and now facing the effects of trade tensions, felt the hit almost immediately. Back home, the situation on the ground for farmers was deteriorating. Prices for core crops began to fall. Corn dropped by over 30%. Soybeans were down by more than 20%. Wheat, long considered a backbone of U.S. farming, saw a decline of over 35%. These weren't ordinary market corrections. They were deep, sustained drops that made profitability nearly impossible for small to mid-sized farms. At the same time, the costs of running those farms were climbing fast. Diesel fuel reached historic highs. Fertilizer prices more than doubled in some regions. And the equipment farmers needed to keep operations going was now largely unaffordable. A new combine harvester could cost upwards of $700,000. Even a basic tractor might be priced at over $300,000. For many, these numbers meant one thing: the end. Family farms that had operated for generations were being pushed into bankruptcy. Equipment dealerships reported slower sales, especially in new machines. Banks that once offered lines of credit to farmers were tightening lending standards. And in small rural towns across the Midwest, local economies began to suffer as farming incomes dried up. John Deere, which had once been a symbol of stability in these communities, was now seen differently. By choosing to move jobs to Mexico, the company had broken a sense of trust with its customer base. Farmers who had stood by the brand through economic downturns now felt left behind. Deere's move, though possibly justified from a business standpoint, looked to many like abandonment during a time of crisis. Sales within the company's U.S. division declined. Dealers reported fewer upgrades and more inquiries about used or third-party equipment. Some farmers began turning to more affordable foreign brands. Others delayed purchases altogether. Even those who could afford new machinery were hesitant. With crop prices falling and exports uncertain, spending large amounts on equipment no longer felt sustainable. Adding even more pressure to the already fragile system was a new development from Washington: a renewed immigration crackdown. President Trump launched a fresh campaign targeting undocumented workers, including new enforcement policies, stricter penalties for employers, and expanded Border Patrol operations. While these moves were framed as part of a broader national security strategy, the practical effect on agriculture was devastating. Over 70% of U.S. farm workers are foreign-born, and the majority are undocumented. These workers perform the difficult physical labor that few Americans are willing to take on: picking crops, maintaining fields, and managing the harvest in extreme conditions. When enforcement increased, farms in California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida reported immediate labor shortages. Crops began to rot in the fields. Harvest deadlines were missed. Some farms were forced to scale back operations or leave parts of their land uncultivated. Attempts to hire local workers failed. The work was tough, the pay was modest, and the labor pool simply wasn't there. The United States had long embraced just-in-time manufacturing. It's a system designed for speed and efficiency, where companies keep inventory levels low and rely on frequent, precise deliveries to keep assembly lines running. For years, this model worked well. It cut storage costs and allowed for faster adaptation to market demand. But it also came with a major downside. When something goes wrong, there's no cushion. That weakness came into full view as the flow of parts from Mexico stopped. Across states like Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, production lines fell silent. Vehicles sat half-built on factory floors, missing key components such as wiring harnesses, transmissions, and battery modules. These weren't optional add-ons. They were fundamental to the operation of every car coming off the line. Major automakers like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis found themselves in a difficult position. The problem wasn't a lack of demand. It wasn't even a labor issue at this stage. It was simply that the parts they needed weren't arriving. The supply chain had frozen and there was no backup plan. The entire system had been built on the assumption that cross-border trade would remain fluid and reliable. That assumption had now failed. Thousands of workers were impacted. With production halted, companies were forced to send employees home or suspend shifts. For hourly workers, this meant lost income. For managers and executives, it meant a scramble to reassess schedules, contracts, and delivery targets. For communities that rely on these jobs, the sudden halt created economic uncertainty. But the problem didn't stop with the automakers themselves. The auto industry is supported by a vast network of suppliers, logistics companies, and service providers. Steel producers who supplied raw materials began reporting dips in orders. Trucking firms that moved goods across the border were left with fewer shipments. Warehouses and distribution centers began to fill with unfinished products or stood half-empty. The entire ecosystem began to stall. Even companies known for their independence and innovation weren't immune. Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid, companies often celebrated for vertical integration and supply chain control, found themselves caught up in the same crisis. Their reliance on components produced or processed in Mexico made them just as vulnerable to the disruption. As financial analysts tried to assess the full scope of the damage, it became clear that this wasn't just about a trade disagreement. It was a structural issue. The U.S. had outsourced significant portions of its manufacturing capacity, not just to save money, but to meet the demand for specialized components that no longer had a domestic equivalent. The cost of that outsourcing was now being paid in lost production, missed deadlines, and falling revenue. With every passing day, the pressure mounted. And as the situation worsened, attention shifted to Washington. Industry leaders called for action. Unions demanded solutions. Investors wanted certainty. But what they got instead was more political brinkmanship. Behind closed doors, diplomatic talks had already begun between the United States and Mexico. These were not the formal public negotiations that usually dominate the headlines. Instead, they were quiet discussions, conducted through back channels and confidential envoys. Both sides were under pressure, but neither wanted to appear weak. Mexico had seen a sudden surge in political and economic leverage. The United States, meanwhile, was led by a president who had built much of his image on projecting strength. Mexico made its demands clear. It would not resume the export of critical auto parts unless the United States lifted the newly imposed tariffs and provided assurances against future trade penalties. The Mexican government framed its position as defensive, not aggressive. They argued they were protecting their economy and responding to what they saw as unfair treatment. The Trump administration, however, wasn't ready to make concessions. Any retreat from the tariff policy could be seen as backing down. The White House insisted that the tariffs were necessary to secure border cooperation and reestablish trade fairness. Officials claimed that the damage would be temporary and that Mexico would eventually give in. While the standoff dragged on, the international community started to get involved. Canada, which shares deep trade ties with both the United States and Mexico, stepped forward with offers to mediate. Officials in Ottawa stressed the risk to the entire North American supply chain and warned that continued disruption would cause long-term harm. The European Union expressed concern too. European manufacturers with operations in North America were beginning to feel the effects, particularly those who sourced parts through Mexico or assembled products for export to the U.S. Some EU officials began floating the idea of retaliatory tariffs if the trade war escalated further. Japan also stepped into the conversation. Japanese automakers such as Toyota, Honda, and Mazda operate major factories in both the United States and Mexico. With shipments now delayed and inventories shrinking, Japanese trade officials began pushing for resolution. They made it clear that if the current instability continued, companies might start relocating production outside of the region altogether. Despite all this pressure, progress remained slow. Talks between American and Mexican trade envoys continued late into the night. Proposals were made and rejected. Counteroffers were floated and revised. The issue wasn't just economics, it was political theater. Both countries wanted to claim victory, and neither wanted to appear as if they had given in first. In the meantime, the damage continued. U.S. automakers faced lawsuits from dealerships that couldn't get vehicles to customers. In Mexico, factories began putting pressure on their own government to resolve the dispute. Plant owners who had invested heavily in cross-border trade wanted stability restored as soon as possible. Weeks passed. Supply chains remained frozen. The stock market fluctuated daily with each new headline or rumor. And across America, the public began to realize just how fragile the system really was. There had always been an assumption that the U.S. economy was resilient, capable of adapting to shocks. But this time, the shock had come from within. The irony wasn't lost on many observers. Policies that were supposed to protect American jobs and strengthen domestic industry had exposed just how deeply reliant that same industry was on foreign partners. The attempt to isolate and control trade relationships had created uncertainty, not independence. As the situation entered its third week, the standoff itself became symbolic. It wasn't just about cars or tariffs anymore. It was about how global economies operate in the 21st century, interconnected, interdependent, and vulnerable to disruption in ways that are hard to predict and even harder to control. Mexico, once thought of as the junior partner in NAFTA-era trade deals, had shown that it could push back. It had used its position in the supply chain strategically and effectively, and by doing so, it had challenged the conventional wisdom that the U.S. could dictate terms without consequence. In the end, it wasn't clear who would blink first. But what was certain was that this moment had shifted the landscape. Businesses would remember it, governments would study it, and voters would ask whether their leaders truly understood the complexities of modern trade. The lessons were hard-earned. American manufacturing had been built for efficiency, not resilience. The supply chain wasn't broken. It had been built brittle from the start. The attempt to strong-arm trade partners without preparing for the consequences had backfired.